Megan Hughes gathered a fistful of chestnut hair in one hand and closed the scissors around it, and the sound was small, almost gentle, like a secret breaking. Loose strands slid onto the white linen tablecloth, and for one long second, nobody in that marble hall dared to breathe. "Now let's see," she said, pitched to carry to every corner of the room. "If you remember your place." Not a single person moved. Housekeepers lowered their eyes to the floor. A guard near the doorway went rigid, staring at nothing in particular. Not one of the nearly 80 staff members gathered beneath that chandelier so much as shifted their weight. Everyone in that hall understood the arithmetic of the moment. Crossing the fiancée of a Mafia boss could end a career, or something far worse. So they did the only safe thing left to them. They looked away. The woman, kneeling among her own fallen hair, did not cry. Leah Collins had never once considered cutting it. It was one of the only things in her life that belonged entirely quietly to her. And now, half of it lay scattered across a floor worth more than the house she'd grown up in. Still, she didn't flinch. She reached up, gathered the rest of it in one steady hand, and did something no one in that room expected. She took the scissors from Megan's grip herself. For several long seconds, the grand hall was silent enough to hear the candles hiss. Then, without anger, without a single tear, Leah finished the job Megan had started, cutting the remaining length down to her chin, right there in front of every witness in the house. When it was done, she looked directly into Megan's eyes. "You just made a mistake," she said, quiet but clear enough to reach the back of the room. "That you will not understand for the rest of your life." She handed the scissors back, smoothed the wrinkles from her apron with both hands, and pushed her cleaning cart back into the hallway as though nothing at all had happened. Megan believed in that triumphant moment that she'd finally put an invisible woman back in her place. She had no idea she'd just made the worst mistake of her life. No one in the Warren estate yet understood that before the week was over, a mansion that had run like clockwork for years would start quietly falling apart. Not because of a rival crime family, not because of violence or betrayal, but because the one woman everyone in that house had spent 4 years overlooking had finally stopped giving more than anyone had ever bothered to ask for. To understand how it got to that chandelier, that pair of scissors, that one unforgettable sentence, we have to go back 9 days to an ordinary Tuesday morning, long before anyone in that house understood what quiet dignity was capable of becoming. Long before sunrise touched Lake Michigan, one light was always burning at the back of the Warren estate on Sheridan Road, Winnetka, Illinois. At exactly 4:30 every morning, Leah Collins unlocked the same side door she'd unlocked for 4 straight years. Never a minute late, never a minute early. She greeted the night guard by name. She asked gently whether his granddaughter's fever in Evanston had broken. She set down a cup of black coffee, no sugar, exactly how he liked it, and disappeared into the depths of the mansion before he could finish thanking her. Nobody had ever instructed her to do any of it. She simply remembered. Remembering was Leah's quiet gift, and in a house of nearly 80 employees spread across 10 acres facing the lake, it was the thing that made everything else look effortless. She remembered the driver's birthday. She remembered that the old gardener's arthritis flared whenever the wind turned cold off the water. She remembered the head accountant's severe mushroom allergy and exactly which night guard preferred cold-cut sandwiches when the snow came in hard. She was 27, with warm brown eyes and hair that had once fallen past her waist in soft chestnut waves. Hair she'd never once considered cutting, because it was one of the only things in her life that was entirely, quietly her own. Zachary Warren. The 34-year-old man who owned this house was known on the North Shore by two very different reputations. To the neighbors, he was a successful businessman with impeccable manners. To the people who mattered in rooms far from Winnetka, he was a mafia boss, the kind whose calm voice was more frightening than anyone else's shouting. Around his own staff, though, he was mostly just a tired man who sometimes nodded his thanks to Leah as he passed her in the hallway. It never lasted more than a few seconds. His gray-blue eyes would meet hers. The black tattoo curling above his collar would catch the light, and then he'd move on. It was nothing. A few seconds, a passing nod. But Megan Hughes had been counting those seconds for a long time. Megan was 29, platinum blonde, sharp-boned, and immaculate, engaged to Zachary for the better part of a year. A match that was as much business as it was romance. The Hughes family carried old money and older friendships across Chicago's North Shore, and their backing mattered to a mafia boss whose business depended on partners who trusted his judgment as much as his power. Megan knew this. She wore it like armor, and she had never once had to compete with a member of the household staff for anyone's attention, until she noticed the nods. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself a maid was not a rival. But she watched anyway, the way Zachary's gaze would land on Leah for half a second longer than it needed to, the way the staff turned to Leah instead of her when something went wrong, the way an entire 80-person household seemed to run on the quiet competence of a woman who never asked for anything in return. Leah, for her part, noticed none of it. In 4 years of service, she had never once left early, never once complained, never once asked for a raise. On the nights of the estate's largest parties, long after guests and staff alike had gone home, she was often still on her knees, scrubbing wine stains out of a Persian rug that cost more than most people's cars. No one ordered her to stay. She stayed because she'd learned a long time ago exactly what happened to people who stopped making themselves useful. She sent almost everything she earned back to Rockford, Illinois, where a young cousin was growing up in daycare, and she had nowhere else to go if she ever lost this job. She had learned that lesson at 19, the year her parents died in a crash on I-94, when an aunt who never wanted her had taken a pair of kitchen shears to her hair and told her she ate too much and took up too much room in a house that was never truly hers. Leah hadn't cried that day. She'd simply understood, with the flat clarity of someone much older, that some people only feel secure when they've made someone else feel small. She carried that lesson quietly for 8 years. She had no idea it was about to be tested again by a woman in an ivory gown who had started keeping a private, careful list of every small moment Leah had ever been noticed instead of her. That Tuesday evening, Zachary told his staff he'd be flying into downtown Chicago for several days to meet with rival families near the West Side. The kind of meetings only a mafia boss with something to protect ever has to sit through, and left the house for a little while without him. Megan smiled when she heard. It was the kind of smile that made the older staff quietly glance at one another and say nothing. None of them could have guessed just how much would change before he came home. By the second morning after Zachary left, the house had already changed shape. Megan gathered every department head beneath the crystal chandeliers of the main hall, dressed in a fitted ivory suit, her spine straight and her voice like ice. "While he's away, every decision goes through me," she said. "I expect absolute obedience." Longtime staff were reassigned to menial labor overnight. Even changing bed linens now required her personal sign-off. The house that had once run with quiet, almost invisible efficiency grew tense footsteps, softer conversations, shorter. Leah kept working exactly as she always had. She still offered a steady smile to the newest housemaid, still struggling to set silverware correctly. She still reminded the chef gently that one of the evening's guests carried a severe almond allergy, the kind of detail that made dinners run smoothly, and that nobody but Leah ever seemed to remember. That evening, Leah noticed that 2 place cards for an upcoming dinner had been switched, seating 2 business rivals men who'd once bankrupted each other in court directly beside one another. She reported it quietly to Megan, who didn't look up. "I arranged it correctly," Megan said flatly. Minutes later, a passing manager spotted the same error, corrected it immediately, and thanked Leah warmly in front of several staff. It lasted 5 seconds. To Megan, it landed like a slap delivered in public. That same night, Megan slipped into the small staff quarters room where Leah slept. In a desk drawer, she found a single thank you card, its edges gone soft and yellow with age. The handwriting was unmistakably Zachary's. "Thank you for keeping everything steady while I was away. Z.W." Megan's fingers closed around the card until the corner crumpled. Megan's fury in that moment was never really about a maid. It was about a woman who had built her entire identity on being chosen for her name, her bloodline, her polish. Suddenly realizing that the one thing she couldn't buy or inherit was the quiet trust Leah had earned by simply showing up year after year without asking for credit. Underneath the jealousy was an older fear that she had always been loved for what she represented, and never once for who she actually was. From that moment on, her jealousy stopped being a suspicion. It became a decision. 2 nights later, the estate hosted a diplomatic dinner Megan had been overseeing in Zachary's absence. She deliberately assigned Leah to serve wine near the head table, hoping to manufacture the image of a clumsy, overexposed maid for when Zachary came home and heard about it. Leah simply stood, straight-backed, eyes forward, and executed the assignment flawlessly, refilling glasses with a precision that infuriatingly drew more quiet compliments than complaints. Halfway through the evening, Leah noticed the head accountant's wine glass had been paired with a canapé plate containing crushed almonds, the very allergy she'd flagged that morning. She corrected it without a word, sliding the plate away before anyone noticed. A junior server saw her do it and mentioned it admiringly to a supervisor within earshot of Megan. That was the moment something in Megan went quiet and cold. Later that night, she called her parents' estate in Lake Forest. Her voice was soft, but every word was calculated. "I need Father to move a few of his own people into the house," she murmured into the phone. "Just for now, just to replace some of the staff." Down in the basement staff quarters, Leah sat on the edge of her iron frame bed, a small wooden box resting on her lap. She didn't open it yet. She simply held it and whispered one word into the empty room. Enough. She didn't yet know how right she was to say it, or how soon the house would learn exactly what 4 years of being underestimated could cost. Megan just declared quiet war on the one person holding this entire house together, and Leah said nothing back. Was that wisdom or a mistake she'll regret? Team silence or team fight back? Drop your team in the comments before next part. The diplomatic dinner ended a little after 11. Most of the guests had gone. What remained was the staff, tired and quiet, clearing the last of the glassware, and Megan, still simmering from the almond incident, still furious that a maid's competence kept outshining her authority. She found Leah near the cleaning cart at the edge of the main hall and called the remaining staff to gather. Nearly 30 of them were still on shift. Word spread fast enough that more drifted in from the kitchen and the hallways until 80 pairs of eyes were fixed on the 2 women beneath the chandelier. Megan picked up a pair of sewing scissors someone had left forgotten on the cart. "Now let's see," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "If you remember your place." She reached out and gathered a fistful of Leah's long chestnut hair that fell past her waist. Leah had never once considered cutting. The blades closed with a sharp, cold click. Strands fell across the white apron and onto the marble floor. Leah didn't move. She didn't cry out. Only the faintest narrowing of her eyes betrayed the wave of loss crashing through her, not because of the pain, which was nothing, but because some part of her recognized this feeling far too well. She had stood exactly this still once before, at 19, in a kitchen in Rockford. Leah's silence was never weakness. It was a survival skill she had perfected years before she ever set foot in this house. Somewhere along the way, she had learned that fighting back only gave people a reason to punish her twice. Her real fear was never losing her hair. It was losing the last shred of control she had over how she let the world see her break. Standing still was the only power she had left, and in that hall, it was the loudest thing in the room. She reached out, took the scissors gently from Megan's hand, and finished the job herself, cutting the rest down to her chin in front of every witness in that hall, her hands steady the entire time. When it was done, soft waves framed a face that had gone calm and unreadable. She looked directly into Megan's eyes. "You just made a mistake," Leah said, quiet but clear enough to reach the back of the hall, "that you will not understand for the rest of your life." She handed back the scissors, smoothed her apron with both hands, and pushed her cart out of the hall in absolute silence. Not one person moved to stop her. Not one person looked away fast enough to miss it. That night alone in her small room, Leah stared at the plastic bag holding what remained of her hair. She wrote a letter of resignation by hand and set it on the desk, not to submit it yet, but to know it was there. Then she opened the small wooden box she'd been holding 2 nights before. Inside was a single folded note dated 3 years earlier and a thin notebook. The note recorded the day Zachary had nearly been poisoned by a gift box sent from a rival family, and the fact that Leah, working alone in the kitchen that morning, had quietly disposed of it and replaced it before anyone else arrived. She had never told a soul. She'd been terrified that admitting she'd touched it first would make her the obvious suspect, instead of the one who'd saved him. The notebook was 4 years of careful observation, every operational blind spot in the household she'd noticed and quietly compensated for, without anyone ever asking her to. She closed both away in the deepest drawer of her dresser. The next morning she arrived at exactly 4:30 precisely, as her contract required, not a second more. She reminded no one of anything. She brought no coffee. She checked no menus. For the first time in 4 years, Leah simply did her job, and nothing else. The failures began almost immediately, and they escalated fast. At lunch, a rich mushroom cream soup was served to the head accountant, who nearly went into anaphylactic shock and had to be rushed to urgent care. That afternoon, a driver arrived 47 minutes late collecting an important attorney from O'Hare, having misread the pickup time. The attorney, furious, threatened to end the partnership entirely. Then came something larger. A $4.2 million transport contract nearly collapsed over a scheduling error. The partner on the other end called Zachary directly in Chicago, his voice raw with anger down the line. On the 4th day, a section of the lakeside entrance sat unpatrolled for nearly 2 hours after a shift schedule conflict left it empty. A car appeared and disappeared from the property line. Infrared security cameras later caught a figure photographing the greenhouse layout and the emergency exits, a rival organization quietly scouting a house that had clearly suddenly stopped running like clockwork. Department heads began arguing openly in meetings. Megan, cornered by chaos she couldn't manage alone, glanced toward Leah, standing at the back of the room, half expecting her to step in and fix everything, the way she always had. Leah simply noted her own cleaning duties for the day and walked out without a word. That night, the head of security sent an urgent report to Zachary's phone in Chicago, photographs of the intruder attached. The final line read, "If Miss Leah were still working the way she used to, this never would have happened. Zachary stared at the screen in silence, his jaw tightening. He had no idea yet what "the way she used to" even meant. Friday afternoon, Zachary's convoy rolled slowly up Sheridan Road toward the estate. Something felt wrong from the moment he stepped through the gates. Staff bowed in greeting, but no one held his gaze. A painting in the entrance hall hung slightly crooked. A vase of lilies sat wilted and untouched. The security report still lay unopened on his desk, exactly where it had been left 3 days earlier. He found Leah on the second-floor landing, carrying a basket of clean towels. Her chin-length hair made him stop mid-stride. "You cut your hair?" he asked, his voice low. "I wanted a change." Leah answered, too smooth, too practiced. He studied her for a long moment and read something in her eyes that wasn't deception. It was protection. He spent the next hour questioning every department head, one after another, in a flat, deliberate voice, the same voice that had made rival families across the West Side think twice before crossing him. Every answer came back the same. Nothing unusual had happened. Not one person spoke Megan's name. Slowly, he understood. The fear holding this house together in his absence was bigger than the chaos itself. Everyone was protecting someone through their silence, and he intended to find out who. That night, he walked out to the greenhouse where Peter Fisher, the estate's gardener for longer than Zachary had been alive, was trimming roses by lantern light. The old man set down his shears and studied his employer for a long moment before speaking. "She cut Miss Leah's hair in front of all of us," Peter said quietly, "right there in the main hall. Miss Leah didn't cry. She finished the job herself and went back to work like nothing happened. And ever since that night, sir, this house has been ashamed of itself." He hesitated, then went on. "There's something else you don't know. 3 years ago, the week you nearly got sick from that gift box the Marchetti people sent, it was Miss Leah who found it wrong and got rid of it before anyone else came near it. I saw her do it with my own eyes. She never told your security team because she was afraid they'd think she'd done something to it herself instead of the other way around. I gave her my word I'd never say a thing. I'm only breaking that word now because I think it's time you knew who you actually owe." Zachary went completely still. Wind moved off Lake Michigan through the open greenhouse door. For a man who had spent his entire adult life measuring loyalty in leverage and debts owed, the idea that someone had saved his life and asked for nothing in return didn't fit any framework he understood. His stillness in that greenhouse wasn't shock. It was the quiet collapse of a belief system built on the assumption that everyone eventually wants something. Beneath his composure sat a harder truth. He had built an empire on being feared, and it had never once occurred to him that the safest person in it was the one he'd barely noticed. For the first time in years, he understood with total clarity that he owed a member of his own staff more than he'd ever owed anyone in his life, including the woman he was supposed to marry. When he walked back inside, a plain white envelope waited on his desk, the infrared photographs of the intruder scouting the greenhouse and the exits, along with the security chief's handwritten note. If Miss Leah were still working the way she used to, this never would have happened. He sat down slowly, looking between the photograph of the intruder and the memory of Leah's shortened hair. His jaw tightened until it ached. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't call anyone in a panic. A Mafia boss who reacted in anger had already lost, and he knew it. He simply turned to the head of security waiting outside his study door and said one sentence in a voice colder than anyone in that hallway had ever heard from him. "Prepare a staff appreciation dinner. 2 days from now. I want every single person in this house there, no exceptions." The hallway went silent in a way that felt entirely different from the silence of the last 4 days. 2 days later, all 80 employees of the Warren estate received a handwritten invitation to a surprise appreciation dinner. The ballroom had been transformed, candlelight throwing soft gold across the walls, fresh flowers replacing every wilted arrangement in the house, a table set for a household rather than a staff roster, silver polished to a shine that caught and scattered the candlelight across the ceiling. Megan arrived in an emerald gown, certain this evening would finally announce her as the future lady of the house. She'd spent the afternoon telling herself as much, standing in front of her mirror, rehearsing the small, gracious smile she planned to give the staff when Zachary finally put an end to the incident everyone kept tiptoeing around. When the seating was revealed, the chair beside Zachary sat empty. Megan found herself placed 1 seat to the right of where she expected. Her smile didn't move, but her eyes did, flicking once toward the empty chair and then away quick enough that only the servers standing nearby caught it. Megan had grown up watching her mother rearrange herself for every room she entered, softer for her father's business partners, sharper for her father's rivals, always calculating which version of herself the moment required. She had learned, long before she ever met Zachary, that a seat at the table was never given for free. It was earned through vigilance, through never once letting your guard down long enough for someone else to take your place. That empty chair beside Zachary wasn't just an insult. It was the exact fear she had built her entire adult life around, arriving all at once in front of 80 witnesses. Zachary rose. The room fell quiet immediately, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that presses gently against the chest. "I used to think this house ran on discipline and money," he said, his voice slow and even, carrying easily to the back of the room without him ever raising it. "I was wrong." He asked one question. "How many people in this room have been helped at some point by Leah Collins?" The silence lasted exactly as long as it takes to hold your breath. Then Mrs. Allison Reed stood first, her chair scraping softly against the floor. The chef followed, wiping his hands on his apron out of habit before rising. Then a driver, then a security guard, then 2 housemaids who'd barely been at the estate a year and still stood as though pulled upright by something larger than themselves. One by one, nearly all 80 people rose to their feet, until the room was a standing wall of quiet gratitude, with one seated figure at its center. Only Megan remained seated, the color draining slowly from her face. Mrs. Allison walked to the front of the room and set a thin notebook on the table in front of Zachary. "This is Miss Leah's," she said, her voice thick. "She wrote down every weak spot in this house so the rest of us would never have to fail at our jobs. I kept it safe after the night her hair was cut. I was afraid she'd leave us, and I wanted something of hers to remember her by if she did." A young houseman near the back, barely 20, spoke up without being asked, his voice cracking slightly.
"She covered 2 of my shifts my first month here, sir, when my mother was in the hospital in Waukegan. She never told anyone. I only found out because I saw the schedule log."
Zachary opened the notebook's first page. Leah's handwriting was steady and plain. "If I'm ever not here to catch it, remember to check the Lakeside Patrol schedule on Fridays." He closed the notebook slowly and crossed the room to stand beside Leah, who had been trying quietly to disappear into the crowd, her shoulders drawn in the way they always were when too many eyes landed on her at once. His voice carried easily to every corner of the ballroom. "They told you that you were only a maid," he said. "They forgot to mention that you were the reason this whole house was ever able to call itself a family." He turned to Megan. The candlelight caught the hard, bright edge in her eyes. Not quite tears, not yet, but something close to them, held back by sheer will. He set his engagement ring on the table in front of her, slowly, deliberately. The the small sound of metal against wood, impossibly loud in the silence.
"The engagement ends tonight," he said. "I know what it costs me with your family, and I've made my peace with that. I choose character over an alliance built on cruelty." Megan's voice shook as she tried to protest.
It was just hair.
The words came out smaller than she meant them to, and for one unguarded second, she looked less like the woman who had run this household with an iron hand for 4 days, and more like a girl who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered.
Zachary's answer came without heat, which made it land harder than shouting ever could have. No, it was dignity. If you could do that to the person with the least power in this house, one day you'd do it to anyone who had less than you. Security stepped forward, quiet and professional, and Megan was escorted from the ballroom without another word from anyone in the room. She didn't look back at the table, at the ring, at any of it, only straight ahead, spine still perfectly straight, the last piece of armor she had left. Not a single person turned to watch her go. As the doors closed behind her, Zachary remained standing beside Leah, looking out at 80 people still on their feet. "There's one more thing," he said, "that I need this house to know." The ballroom broke into long, warm applause for Leah. She covered her face and cried not the tears of someone humiliated, but the tears of someone finally fully seen after 4 years of not being. Somewhere behind her, she heard Peter Fisher clapping with both weathered hands raised above his head, and the sound of it undid something in her chest that 4 years of silence had held shut. Zachary offered her the position of Director of Staff Welfare and Household Operations. Leah shook her head gently, an old reflex rising before she could stop it.
I'm just a maid,
she said, the old habit still catching in her throat like a stone she'd swallowed years ago and never managed to cough back up. Mrs. Allison smiled through her own tears. No, sweetheart, you were never just a maid. You're the reason this place has ever felt like a home instead of a house. Then Zachary reached into his jacket and drew out a folded set of legal papers already signed weeks earlier, long before the haircut, long before he'd known anything was wrong. I started this the week Peter told me about the gift box, he said, quietly, for her alone at first, and then loud enough for the room. A debt like that doesn't wait for a good moment to be paid. He set the papers on the table in front of her. As of tonight, 30% ownership in the transport division belongs to you, and full authority over how this house is run belongs to you as well. Not out of pity, because I need you. This family needs you. Leah stood very still. The room had gone quiet enough to hear the candle flames. It was the largest reversal any of them had ever witnessed. A woman publicly humiliated over her hair, now standing as an owner and the true authority of the very house that had once cut it. Even a mafia boss, it turned out, could be brought to his knees by nothing more than the truth spoken plainly by an old man in a greenhouse. A month later, the estate ran on something it hadn't had in years: openness instead of fear. Every staff member felt recognized in ways they never had before. No one carried the weight of the household alone anymore. Leah led with respect, not silence. And for the first time, she found herself asking her staff what they needed before they had to find a quiet, careful way of asking her. One spring afternoon, she and Zachary walked together through the gardens overlooking the lake, the air smelling faintly of turned earth and the first roses of the season. He stopped beside an old stone fountain, water catching the light in small, restless pieces. "I'm sorry I didn't see you," he said. Leah looked at the roses climbing the fountain's edge, choosing her words the way she chose everything, carefully, without waste. "My grandmother used to say, kindness doesn't lose its value just because no one notices it," she said. "You didn't fall in love with me because of my hair.
You saw me because I finally stopped hiding behind it.
She told him for the first time about the aunt in Rockford, a woman named Carol, who had taken her in after the accident on I-94 out of obligation rather than love, and who had made sure Leah understood every day for 8 years exactly how much that obligation cost her. She told him about the lonely nights scrubbing floors alone in that house before she was old enough to leave it, and about the day the shears had come out over something as small as a second helping at dinner. She told him about her cousin Maya, 7 years old now, growing up in Rockford with a grandmother too tired to do much more than keep her fed and in school, and how nearly everything Leah earned went back to that small brick house so Maya could have things Leah never had: dance lessons, a winter coat that fit the quiet luxury of not being told she took up too much room. Zachary listened without interrupting, the way she'd noticed he listened to very few people. When she finished, he took her hand, his thumb moving once, gently over her knuckles. "You don't carry any of it alone anymore," he said. "Maya doesn't either. I'll make sure of that." Leah's eyes stung, and this time she let them. A year later, in a small stone chapel outside Winnetka, Leah still wore her hair short. Sunlight came through a high window and settled over the aisle in a long, quiet band. And somewhere near the front pew sat a girl of 8 in a new dress, sitting very straight, watching everything with wide, careful eyes. A girl who would grow up knowing, in a way Leah never had, that she belonged somewhere. Before Leah stepped through the doors, she leaned toward Zachary and said quietly, "I keep it this length to remind myself that dignity was never about how long it was. It was about whether I stood up straight the moment it was taken."
They walked in together under the afternoon light. Behind them, the estate stood quiet, not because one woman was silently holding it up on her own, but because an entire household had finally learned how to hold it together. This story reminds us that dignity was never Leah's hairstyle, her paycheck, or her title. It was the steadiness she kept, even when the room went cold around her. If you've spent years managing everyone else's schedule and comfort, while quietly wondering whether anyone noticed, you're not alone, and you were never invisible. Here's something practical. The next time someone treats your kindness like it's owed to them, say one honest sentence out loud, the way Leah did. You don't need a speech. One sentence is enough to remind a room who you are. If you're recently widowed or newly retired, and the house feels quieter than it used to, don't wait for someone to throw you an appreciation dinner. Call one person this week who once depended on you, and let them thank you out loud. Most people stay silent, only because they assume you already know how much you mattered. And if you've been underestimated for years, write it down somewhere the way Leah did in her notebook. Not for revenge, just so you remember in your own handwriting exactly how much you've held together. What did you think of Leah's transformation from an invisible maid to a woman who finally stood in her own power? Tell us in the comments. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and second chances.